There are a lot of videos on my channel that I want to upload with topics to do outside of metal music. And even though I want to get to them, I still feel like I'm obligated to do this video first for a multitude of reasons. One being the fact that roughly around 8 months ago, I think, I had a poll asking you guys what band I should do next in this explaining video, and one of them was Abigor. And even though I did the other 3 bands first, because Abigor got the least amount of votes, I was always prepared to do a video on them, but I always got sidetracked doing a video on another band or another subgenre. And as the months went on and I was getting comments on those videos, every single one, at least one person would comment when I would do a video on Abigor. And the biggest reason being simply, it's fucking Abigor. From their songwriting, musicianship, integrity, and what they basically embody all about black metal to when they started to present day, Abigor is an absolute essential that I truly feel like even though they have a dedicated fan base, they don't really get the recognition that they rightfully deserve. For those who are unaware, Abigor is an Austrian black metal band that formed in 1993. One thing to immediately point out already this early on is that even though Abigor is a band, whenever you look at their lineup from any releases they've ever done, usually it'll consist of 3 members. However, Abigor, when you look at the heart, soul, muscle, and brains of the operation for this band, it's not so much a band as it is a duo. That duo in question usually goes by their initials whenever they credit themselves in lineups. But that would be PK, which his real name is Peter Kubrick, and he usually plays either the guitar or bass, and the other member is TT, his real name being Thomas Tenenberger, and he usually plays the drums mostly, guitar, and bass as well. And typically they play all of the instrumentation throughout most of the Abigor discography. And I say most because there is one release that they aren't both present on it, which I'll talk about obviously later on in this video. As for the individual who does vocals, that's where Abigor usually recruits an outside member who's usually a part in some sense like a collective of members into Abigor, and they don't really contribute any other like musical ideas for the project of Abigor other than just being basically a mouthpiece to have vocals being, spewed out whenever you hear any of Abigor's material. Another bit of interesting information to point out with Abigor when it comes to their early years, and I'm actually kind of like echoing some things I've said before in a video I've done a while back on my summoning video, is that when Abigor started out, they were actually a part of this inner circle in the Austrian black metal scene, that being called the Austrian Black Metal Syndicate. This inner circle mostly had roughly around half a dozen projects and bands in it, but again, the only 2 that most people can really point out are Abigor and Summoning. Even though Abigor would depart from this movement shortly after joining it, a huge reason as to why I do believe they needed this was that, again, back in the early 90s when it came to black metal, it was dominated by all the northern countries in Europe, most particularly all the Scandinavian and Nordic countries really had something going, and everything south from them was kind of like catching up with the overall sound of what black metal was going to become. And in Austria, the black metal scene at this time was just non-existent. So I do believe Abigor being a part of this, inner circle for the short amount of time that they were in, gained them not only a bit of like a community for like getting black metal on its feet in Austria, but also allowed them to have more of this like flexibility in terms of exchanging members and having resources being a bit more available to them. And again, it was more of like this movement to just get Abigor up and running. In the short time period of 1993 to 1994, Abigor would find themselves being extremely busy with putting out releases on a consistent basis, because in that short time period, they were able to put out 5 demos and also a split called The Creation of the Dark Age, which was a 4-way split between Abigor, Summoning, Pazuzu, and Crom, all of which being a part of the Austrian Black Metal Syndicate I just talked about a minute ago. During this period, Abigor consisted of Peter and Thomas writing all of the music for Abigor, and the vocalist they had at the time went by the stage name of Rune. And even though he was only with the band for a year, he was later released from Abigor, as both Peter and Thomas thought that he lacked the motivation and dedication for Abigor to progress onwards. However, with all the material they released, it was able to catch the attention of the record label Napalm Records to sign Abigor to them, and in 1994, Abigor was able to release their debut full-length album, Tongue, Invoke the Dark Age. As one would expect with a 90s black metal band releasing their debut full-length album, sonically this album is very raw and primitive. Artistically speaking, this is Abigor at their most stripped down. If you're looking for any of the experimentations or ambitions that makes Abigor this force to be reckoned with within black metal, you're really not going to find it on this particular release. But if you're looking for the unhinged, vicious nature of what black metal is capable of in music, then I would strongly recommend to check out this album. Because leave it to Abigor, even at their beginnings with their debut full-length album, to introduce this vicious style of black metal, but make it sound so climactic and epic. With Thomas's energetic drum playing, that it's incredible that this man has the energy to play blast beats this fast and consistent throughout the album, when you take into account that most of the songs on this range roughly around 6 to 8 minutes long. So it's incredible in of itself that he's able to play that fast and tight on this album, in my personal view. Along with Peter's guitar playing, that's incredible too that he's able to match up with the speed and velocity of Thomas's drum playing, that just enhances just the overall energetic and tight performance that they have, along with these keyboards that are scattered throughout the album as well, that gives off an extra layer of like this sinister melody. And of course, how could I forget the fact that this would be the first album where Abigor would have Satanized on vocals. And yes, the same Satanized from Summoning. And what I've noticed with Satanized's vocal performances on most of the Abigor albums that you can find with him on it, is that with Summoning, Satanized's vocals are more grounded and more straightforward to give off that like prideful and epic sound that they would find themselves being heavily influenced by like the Tolkien universe. Whereas with Satanized on Abigor albums, it's way more savage and wilder, that I feel like he just kind of like lets loose with his vocal range. Thus he sounds like this barbaric madman. And again, it just adds to the intensity of these early Abigor releases, and it is so awesome. Without any signs of slowing down, Abigor would be at the forefront with always putting out new releases continuously, because a year later in 1995, they released Orc Loot, The Retaliation. One thing to point out this early on with this album is that it's only 24.5 minutes long. So some people consider it to be an EP, while websites like Discogs and Metal Archives consider it to be a full length. So for the sake of just like not having any confusion, I'm going to consider this to be their second full-length album. Musically, on the black metal side of things, this album follows the same vicious approach that they did on the debut full-length album. However, one thing you'll notice that is different is the track listing for this album follows a pattern, as one song will be black metal, which you're used to hearing with Abigor. Then the following track will be kind of like this keyboard instrumental interlude track that roughly goes for like around 40 seconds to a minute at most. Then it goes back to black metal, and then it goes back to another keyboard interlude track, and it follows that pattern throughout the whole album. One of the reasons for that approach is that this album is considered to be a concept album based off of the story Storming Onwards on Pagan Paths. The concept is basically an individual having a retelling of all of his events and battles that took place in his life, and all of his feelings, emotions, and viewpoints on the subject matter. So again, I feel like the pacing for it is trying to tell more of a story than just be some kind of like nonsensical, evil black metal album. However, when it comes to the songwriting approach as to why they did this on this album, I think it really goes to what they stated in a 1997 interview that Abigor did for Mourning the Ancient, where Peter talks about the fact that everyone in Abigor is highly influenced and knowledgeable when it comes to classical music. Hence why, when you listen to Abigor's material, even their earliest work, you'll notice not only are the keyboards being played influenced by classical music, but the black metal portions as well. Because yes, Abigor has this vicious and monumental approach that they're known for. And the reason for it is when you look at the transitions and compositions, they come off very extravagant and harmonizing sounding, because while everyone else seemed to be taking inspiration for black metal from bands of the past or what was happening around their scene during the time in the 90s, Abigor was taking a lot more inspiration from classical music, looking at their overall compositions and structure and applying that to black metal. One might say they nailed that approach to absolute perfection with their third full-length album being the fan favorite, Nocturnes from the Twilight Kingdom. This album was released in August of 1995, only 5 months after the release of Orc Loot. So again, Abigor was just relentless with putting out material in their early beginnings. Showcasing my biased love for the album up front, I am with the rest of the pack, because this is the best Abigor album and it's a fan favorite for a reason. Because if you were to ask me, what are the 3 best 90s black metal albums that weren't a part of the Scandinavian or Nordic countries, and I only had 3 options, I would choose Summoning's Minas Morgul, Bethlehem's Dictus Te Nakir, and my third pick would easily be Abigor's Nocturnes. To me, this album is a masterpiece from start to finish, and I really try my best not to overuse the word masterpiece, but this album absolutely deserves it, because it is so sinister, it's so atmospheric, yet everything about it is so captivating. I truly feel like if you are looking for sinister and mystical sounding black metal done to honestly the best way possible in terms of songwriting, composition, execution, guitar riffs, energy, drum performance, vocal performance, this album has it all. All 49 minutes of this album is sensational. There's nothing about it that feels like it's filler. Even the slower and more mellow parts on the album, where I believe it would have a guest appearance by Elizabeth Torreser, still feels really engaging and still really well thought out. Her vocal performance on this is really tender and sweet, and it just adds to kind of like that mystical fantasy world that they're trying to create, and it never feels out of touch. Seriously, every little detail about this album I really do feel like is near perfection when it comes to black metal standards. Then, a year later in 1996, Abigor would release their 4th full-length album, Opus 4. While this is considered to be a full-length album, what it actually is more of a compilation of 2 EPs that were never released by themselves, that being Horns Lurk Beyond the Stars, tracks 1 through 4, and Blut aus Aeons being tracks 5 through 8. And for those who end up listening to this album or know of it, you'll notice on between track 4 and 5, the production value is slightly different, mainly having to do, again, as I stated, they're really more of 2 EPs, as these 2 particular parts were recorded in different studios at different time periods. As for the music on this full-length album, again, it's business as usual with any of Abigor's material. Everything you enjoyed about the albums prior from this are carried over with the ideas and execution onto this. The only differences that I personally notice, if I'm splitting hairs here, is with the reverb being kind of like amplified a bit more. This album comes off a bit more atmospheric than anything else Abigor has done prior to it. But again, I know I'm kind of sounding lazy here with the description. If you enjoy anything Abigor did previous from it, I don't know how you can't enjoy this particular full-length album. A year later, in 1997, Abigor would release an EP called Apocalypse. This EP is roughly only around 17.5 minutes long. It consists 5 tracks, and all of them are roughly around 3 to 4 minutes long of just this total blitz of black metal chaos. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this and what I find interesting about it is going through some interviews that Abigor did in the past. They did one for Second Heart Mag, and what's quite interesting about this is that one of the members, Thomas, believes that out of everything that they did in the 90s, as much as they are, aware of the praise that they get and have pride in the work that they do, They consider that their masterpiece in the 90s is this EP, Apocalypse, which I find quite surprising considering everything else that they've done in that time period gets way more attention. And he doesn't really elaborate onto that other than the fact that I guess he just takes pride in the fact that this album is just so humbling, and they really, I guess, push their limits of what they could do in the aggressive and, sinister sense. So I just wanted to bring this up with this EP. It's definitely something that shouldn't be slept on just solely because it's an EP. But again, I feel like for any Abigor diehard, you know of it and you're aware of how great it is. Once again, it would only be another year later in 1998 where Abigor would release even more material, because in February of 1998 they would release their 5th full-length album, Supreme Immortal Art. The lineup for Abigor at this point has been quite consistent now for a handful of years, of Salinius always on vocals, Peter mainly on guitars, and Thomas on drums. However, with this album, while it still has the same lineup, you're going to notice now there's some differences with it. One being the fact that both Peter and Thomas are playing guitars on this album, and there's no bass, thus you get more of like that dual-wield guitar effect on it, thus making this album feel more technical in execution. The other noticeable difference are the keyboards, which yes, Abigor has utilized them in previous albums to give off more of like this sinister, mystical kind of melody played throughout the black metal. However, on Supreme Immortal Art, the keyboards are a lot more overblown, giving off more of like this symphonic approach now, that I would state this album is really reminiscent to that of like Emperor's Anthems to the Welkin at Dusk. As I stated earlier that an interview Abigor did, all the members are influenced by classical music, and you'll hear that inspiration bleed through on certain songs from albums of the past previous to this one. However, out of everything Abigor has done in their discography that really showcases their inspiration for classical music shine through the most, it's on this album. I'll admit though, the first quarter of the album is a bit slow. Well, yes, it does again have all the attributes you're accustomed to hearing in Abigor. It always feels like these two particular tracks are alluding to something, so it always feels like kind of like a build-up. But once you get to the second half of the album, this is really where the material shines through at the best, and this is where you get like the pinnacle of their symphonic approach. And again, the technical work of the guitar riffs utilized on this album matches just the extravagant sounds of the keyboards and symphonic elements played out as well. So it's like they play off of each other's strengths, I feel like, their approaches. And honestly, again, as much of I'm coming off being overly positive with Abigor right now, it's another great addition into their discography, showcasing again that during the 90s, these guys were on a completely whole other high, I feel like. Because how they were able to make albums with the quality being this high end and well on such a consistent basis, again on a yearly basis, it's truly remarkable. And again, like anything else that Abigor did in the 90s, this needs to be heard. Believe it or not, Abigor would still be consistent on releasing new material, because once again, only a year later in 1999, Abigor would release their 6th full-length album, channeling the quintessence of Satan. This would be the first full-length album Abigor would release where it wouldn't have Salinius be on vocals, as he ended up leaving the band to pursue his main project, of course, being summoning. The new vocalist that Abigor ended up recruiting would be Thoraz, and he's the vocalist for this experimental black metal band called Heidenreich, which is also Peter's side project. Hence why there's a connection for Thoraz as to how he got connected with Abigor to become their vocalist for this album. To be honest, Thoraz's vocal approach on this album is just as vicious as anything else Salinius would do, so honestly it's a great inclusion. So much so that it works, because channeling the quintessence of Satan is easily Abigor playing at their fastest. Which is kind of interesting when you consider the fact that in the late 90s, when the whole second wave black metal boom was starting to fade away, a lot of people were noticing that a lot of these black metal bands like Immortal and Marduk and a handful of others started playing black metal blistering fast. Like, we're talking 280 to like almost 300 BPM was like now the norm for black metal bands. Like, the faster the better. That people were calling it like Norsecore, I guess, was like the nickname for this style of black metal during this time period. And to some people, Abigor is channeling the quintessence of Satan, kind of fits into this very niche approach of what black metal was doing during this time. So I don't really know if like people were saying this as like a nickname to kind of give people the idea of what they were getting into, of more of like this joking insult for the album. Regardless, what this album is just Abigor at like this blitzkrieg of just blistering fast, obnoxiously chaotic black metal that I feel like for people who are just looking for the all thrills with no chills approach in black metal, Abigor has that, especially on channeling the quintessence of Satan. Like, I cannot emphasize it enough that this album is chaotic at any part you listen to within it. And typically I find albums like this to be quite redundant after a while, because when you get around to like the 10 to 15 minute mark, all the songs kind of like bleed into each other of just like riff salad and blast beats being pummeling throughout, and nothing really stands out at that point. But leave it to Abigor to make this simplistic approach of just playing fast still really engaging and memorable. The production value on this is spot on. Everything feels like this one cohesive unit of like this full frontal assault of chaos. None of the instrumentations feel like they're being overpowered from another, and nothing gets lost in the mix. I can't emphasize it enough as well that everything is cohesive and like melds into this one big ball of chaos. And I feel like because of it, when the guitarists change, melodies, or the drumming goes from like blast beats to drum fills, then goes back into blast beats again, it all feels cohesive. It all feels like just chaos all the time. Like, this album is just this one big blitzkrieg of aggression. And I feel like because of that, it becomes memorable. It almost feels like you need to listen to the whole album to just enjoy how aggressive and obnoxious it is. I don't know, to me this is just like chaotic black metal done in the best ways possible. And leave it to Abigor to make such a simple approach of just playing fast sound memorable, even though everything is done almost the same exact way. Abigor's songwriting approach and composition, even at its most barbaric, is still incredible. At the turn of the millennia in 2001, Abigor would release their 7th full-length album, Satanized. For a lot of people, this is considered to be Abigor's worst album out of anything you can hear in their discography. And to be honest, I gotta agree with the pact, because there's quite a bit off with this album. As I stated earlier, almost all of Abigor's material has both Peter Kubik and Thomas Tenenberger on instrumentation with Abigor's material. However, this would be the only full-length album of theirs where it would have Peter Kubik on guitars, but Thomas would not be playing drums. Basically, this is an Abigor album that only really has half of Abigor on it. While yes, they did get a replacement drummer for this album, and one might think, Thomas, he only plays the drums, what's the big deal with that? I really do feel like missing a key member, even if it's just one guy playing one instrument, is still vital to the overall process and songwriting with any band. And with Abigor, when it came to Satanized, that's clearly showcased, because again, for a lot of people this album just feels off. Along with the fact too that the production value is paper thin, that I know Thomas did an interview a few years back about Abigor with Satanized and stated the fact that they messed up on the production value. Napalm Records themselves didn't even advertise or support this album, and it was just kind of like swept away when it came to the promotional aspect about it. It's either often ignored by a lot of Abigor and black metal fans because, again, it didn't get attention, or it's talked about in a negative sense because everything's really off about it. And while, yeah, I agree it's Abigor's worst album, I wouldn't call it this abysmal like pile of garbage, giving it like a 0 out of 10. Because it does have its moments, because again, you still have Peter playing guitar, thus you have like those vicious guitar riffs that you would get in an Abigor album. It's just nothing is as impactful like anything else they would do before and even after this. So while, trying to find like the good in this album, while it will probably always remain as like Abigor's misstep and worst album, there are still some parts about it to admire, but make no mistake about it, everything before and after this is like substantially better. A year later in 2002, Abigor was actually deciding whether or not they would do their first ever live show at a German metal festival, but they decided against that mainly because Peter at the time, which was really the only sole original member for Abigor, really didn't like the idea of like recruiting live members to rehearse with. Plus he also thought Abigor itself, its music and everything it stands for and embodies, really isn't meant for a live performance setting. Then in 2003, Abigor would disband for a short while, but end up reforming in 2006, with both Peter and Thomas rejoining the band. Thus Abigor is back to the essentially original duo lineup that's made them have so much success, at least in the black metal underground. With Abigor fully reformed, they would follow it up now after that news with a comeback album, because in 2007 they would release Fractal Possession. Another album of theirs that's often criticized in a negative way from the Abigor fanbase, mainly because now they're being a lot more technical and experimental with this album, giving off a lot more of this influence with industrial and electronic music, that people just often find it to be the weird era of Abigor. But for me personally, I think this is one of not only the most underrated albums Abigor's done, but honestly one of the most underrated black metal albums you can hear. I do understand that this album is a bit unorthodox for Abigor, considering the fact that everything they've done prior to this, they've never utilized industrial or electronic portions to this degree. The only thing they've utilized electronics for were the keyboards in previous albums to give off more of like that mystical and ancient sound. However, with this album, the industrial and electronic portions are utilized more in this kind of like future cybergenetic diabolical sound. So I get the differences there. However, when it comes to the execution and energy, I still feel like it matches up from anything else Abigor's done in the past. Because the guitar riffs are just as vicious, technical, and diabolical from anything else they've done. The drumming is still pummeling that you would get from Thomas's work, and the atmosphere and tone is still just as evil. So yeah, I do feel like this album is very underrated, and to just dislike it or dismiss it because, ooh, they went weird with it, you're really writing it off way too quickly. The only other things to point out with this album is that this would be their first full-length album that wasn't put out through Napalm Records, but End All Life Productions, along with the fact too that this would be their first full-length album where they would have the vocalist Arthur Rosar on vocals, and his vocal approach is just as wretched and raspy as anyone else's that Abigor has recruited, which is something I've noticed that whenever Abigor has a vocalist doing like the main vocals, it's always someone who just does like wretched and powerful screams, and Arthur's, as I stated, is just as wretched as anyone else that they've had. 3 years later in 2010, Abigor would follow it up with the album Time is the Sulfur in the Veins of the Saint, an excursion of Satan's fragmenting principle, which, yes, I was looking at my computer pronouncing all of that because that is way too long of an album title to remember. So this album only contains 2 tracks, but the album runs for a little over 38 minutes long, both tracks being roughly around a little over 19 minutes long and 18 minutes long. And to put it in short, a lot of this album has to do a lot more now with experimentation, as, yeah, it still has all of the attributes you're used to hearing with Abigor, but there's a lot more transitions in between these songs, as you would imagine, again, both being over 18 and 19 minutes long. Thus, there's a lot more experimentation in terms of the songwriting and transitions now, that there's a lot more like offshoots with these songs, so it's not as consistent as you're used to with Abigor. Thus, it kind of feels a little bit, unbalanced in terms of what you're getting yourself into. So while, yeah, Abigor now at this point has been a band for roughly almost 20 years now in 2010, roughly I think now 17 years to be exact, you know, at some point they need to experiment more and be a bit more, you know, explorative with what they can do with their overall songwriting musicianship skill. So I understand that with the ambition they were going for on it. However, for me personally, if I was to recommend someone this album to get into Abigor, it wouldn't be this, because it just, again, feels like more of like this deep cut for more of like the die-hard Abigor fans to get into if you want to just progress onwards to what Abigor is capable of doing with their musicianship skill. So while I admire it for what it is, it's definitely not the album to start out with if you're trying to get into Abigor. Then in 2014, Abigor would release Leitmotiv Lucifer. To an extent, one might say that this album is Abigor returning to their roots with their songwriting, because not only doesn't it feel as experimental to an extent, as it still has all of like the dual-wield guitars that we know Abigor for utilizing. It's very pumbling and very like ferocious with all of the instrumentation being played, but one of those key factors being that the vocalist, again, has Satanized returning after like, I think at this point, if I'm correct, roughly almost like 15 years or so of being absent with Abigor, and the backing vocals are actually Protector from Summoning, utilizing his vocals. So basically what this album is, to me anyways, of a fan of it, is you get the instrumentation of Abigor, but you get the vocal approach of Summoning. So it's like the best of both worlds for me personally, and as biased as I am to say this, I would state that out of everything Abigor's done in the 21st century, this is arguably their best work. On the production side of things, I can't help but notice that everything sonically sounds a bit more dissonant, and with Abigor giving off like that technical approach that they kind of have with their musicianship skill, I can't help but notice that this album reminds me a little bit too of Deathspell Omega. And I'm trying to state that in a respectful way, because I know when it comes to comparing it to Deathspell Omega from any like modern day black metal band, it's kind of like, yep, you know, nothing new. It's just like another copy and paste Deathspell Omega band. And I'm very aware that Abigor has been around a lot longer than Deathspell Omega, and Abigor, I highly doubt, was ever influenced by an outside black metal band, even Deathspell Omega. But I can't help but just admire the similarities of how this sounds sonically. And again, it's just another reason as to why I state that out of everything Abigor has done in the 21st century, for me, this is their best work. 4 years later, in 2018, Abigor would release their full-length album, Hollenzwang, Chronicles of Perdition. What's crazy to point out here is that out of all the time that Abigor has been active, this would be the longest gap in between full-length albums, that only being 4 years, which is crazy because for most bands, a 4-year gap in between albums is normal. For Abigor, this is the longest. Stylistically, this album carries some of the tropes that you're used to hearing with Abigor, as obviously there are blast beats and tremolo pick guitars scattered throughout it like anything else. However, I've noticed that it's a bit more laid back in terms of the tempo. It feels in some parts more mid-paced, and there's more groove to the guitar riffs being played out. Thus, for some people, it was kind of criticized, I remember, on its release in a negative way because it didn't have the Abigor sound. But for me personally, I don't hear anything that off about it. Maybe people are just being nitpicky about it and wanting Abigor to progress on with the sound that they've done now for, at this point, roughly almost 30 years, because this would be like 25 years that they've been active. But yeah, for me, I don't really hear anything all that different other than there's just more groove with the guitar riffs, but nothing really that significant. But what is noticeably different is, even though it has Satanized once again on lead vocals, when you look at the guest list, there's roughly around half a dozen other vocalists adding in other pitches and harmonizing like choirs with it, that when it comes to the overall vocal approach on this particular Abigor album, it's vastly expanded upon. Overall, I don't really have that much else to say with this album. It's just another solid addition into the Abigor's discography. And one thing I've noticed when it comes to this time period with Abigor from like the late 2010s on to the 2020s is that Abigor is kind of just releasing albums not really out of like hype or like to capitalize on like the trend of black metal. They're kind of just doing it mainly because they can, they have the skill to do so, and they're kind of just aware of like the impact they kind of have on black metal, that they don't really need to hype up or do anything that you know, out of the ordinary anymore. I feel like they're just kind of carrying the torch of the spirit of black metal that they've had from the beginning in the early 90s to present day. Because one thing I noticed continuously with every Abigor interview I read is that when it came to their viewpoints with black metal and their overall viewpoints with Satanism, it's just kind of like they're just carrying the spirit. They're not really trying to break new grounds anymore. They're not trying to, you know, get new listeners into black metal and be wowed by it. It just seems like they're so embedded into the idea of what made them interested with black metal in the early 90s that they just want to keep carrying that spirit onwards now. And I feel like that's what these albums are kind of representing when you get to the later era of it. So yeah, I don't really have much else to say with it, not because I'm trying to be lazy and just kind of cut corners, just saying, it's a good album and they kind of do the same thing, that's it. These albums really just embody what Abigor is, that they want to remain this way with black metal and their viewpoints with Satanism all the time, just really expressing it because they can, and then just moving on to the next piece. As we reach the decade of the 2020s, Abigor will release another full-length album titled, and hopefully I say this somewhat correctly because it's in German, that being Totschläger, a Saint Slayer's Songbook. I remember so distinctly when this album dropped, it just came out of the blue in December. There wasn't any hype for it, no label was trying to get people interested with it, there wasn't any teaser song, no promo track, it just came out of the blue, it was released in December, and albums were ready to go with no pre-orders. And again, I state all this because it goes back to the notion, as I stated earlier, I really just don't feel like Abigor is trying to wow the black metal listener anymore in the sense of like, let's capitalize on hype and let's cash in on this. They're doing it mainly because they want to, they have the passion to do so, and they just know who they are at this point. They're Abigor. They proved what they needed decades ago, and they're just releasing stuff knowing that the people who are dedicated to black metal and dedicated to Abigor themselves will reach out and get this album when it's released. And yeah, I remember that so distinctly, and just that message that Abigor had with just releasing it out of the blue showcases that attitude, I feel like, marketing wise anyway. Now, for a lot of people, this album is like the album in the 21st century for Abigor, where they're returning to their roots, mainly because it's often compared to that to Nocturnes, the fan favorite. While I understand that it has the attributes that we know Abigor for, of like that melodic and sinister sound that they utilize with the guitar riffs, which I know I've stated numerous times in this video, so apologies that I keep repeating myself with that description. Yeah, it has those attributes, although I wouldn't state it's as raw as Nocturnes, as it has more of like that modern day Abigor sound, as the production value comes off a lot more crisp and clear. So personally, I just kind of feel like this is Abigor with the modern day approach more than anything else. But the one noticeable thing I really enjoyed about this album a lot, because again, as it states with the lineup, it's Peter, Thomas, and Salinius, is that if this really is just all Salinius, this is really incredible that Salinius is able to perform vocals this powerful still to this day, as he's been active with black metal now at least from this point up to nearly 30 years. And one thing that he does with this album I notice is that a lot of the lyrics are in German, and I've never heard Salinius, that I'm aware of anyway, do vocals while speaking German, and it is just so obnoxiously powerful and in your face and obnoxious. And honestly, the thing that sells me with this album is Salinius' vocal performance, because it is just so incredibly in your face, and I fucking love it. Along with the fact too that there are some songs on this album that feels a bit more ritualistic with how the guitars are being played out, and the drumming kind of becomes a bit more intricate with everything. So it really feels like this monumental ritual kind of takes place scattered throughout the album with how it's being laid out. So again, even to this day, Abigor is still trying new ideas and being ambitious with their sound. And I feel like that's why, again, they've had such a dedicated fan base who know of them to this day. Because Abigor is always going to have elements that are from the past that remind you and reminisce of things that they did in the 90s, but they're not afraid to push the limit and experiment in some ways to showcase ambition and to just showcase, again, just how talented they are as musicians. Which now brings us to the latest full-length album by Abigor, and once again, it was released out of the blue only a month ago in December of 2023. That being titled, which I can't pronounce in German, so I'm just going to say the English translation, Songs in the Corpse Light of the World. So this will be a first here on my channel, but I have not listened to this album for a handful of reasons. One being the fact that this album, again, came out of the blue. It wasn't only until roughly around a week ago I realized that this album dropped. And the other reason being, well, no one's uploaded it on the internet yet to listen to. Even on Abigor's Bandcamp, it's not even uploaded. So maybe it could be the fact that no one's gotten around to it, or the fact that Abigor really just wants it to be, in order to listen to this album like it did in the old school days of the 90s, you had to go out and buy it. Maybe that's one of the reasons. I just have yet to go out and buy the album or put an order in for it. So I can't really give you any context into what this album sounds like. But if anything, from what I'm hearing, how people are praising it already on the internet from the people who have bought it, and just knowing the fact that it's Abigor attached with it, I can only conclude the fact that this album probably is great, and it's definitely worth purchasing if that's what the pattern is with Abigor. So I can't really say anything about it, sadly, but if anyone's listened to it and you want to put your overall opinion about it, I'd gladly love to hear it in the comments. I'm well aware that I've talked about Abigor now for probably a little over half an hour, if not more. I know this is going to be a very lengthy video. But in conclusion with these guys, what I admire so much about them is that they are so dedicated to black metal fully. From beginning to end, they've always been dedicated to the idea and aesthetic of black metal. When every other 90s black metal band has kind of been like engulfed and indulged in the idea of Satanism, black metal and all of its cliches, and then kind of like disowns it later on in their lives, or you have all of these newer black metal bands that kind of adapt it like unwillingly because it's the black metal way, Abigor is kind of like the only one that I can think of that from day one when they started, when black metal was in its heyday in Europe to present day, have always been dedicated to black metal and its art and its aesthetic non-stop. And I feel like because of that, it just, you come to admire them more as musicians and what they represent in black metal, whether you find it cartoonish or just some kind of like gimmick. They are dedicated to it, make no mistake about it. And I feel like their music is a reflection of their dedication and what they're able to do when pushing themselves when creating music. And as I stated in the beginning of this video, and I'll state it here again, they are an essential and arguably one of the best black metal bands that you can listen to. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Mainly will be Abigor's Bandcamp, where you can listen to a majority of their discography there. And yeah, other than that, like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.